BBC News with Sue Montgomery. Brazil's foreign minister has criticised the paralysis of the UN Security Council on the wars in Gaza and Ukraine as he opened a G20 meeting in Rio de Janeiro. When Brazil took over the rotating presidency of the Group of 20 in December, it said it hoped it could be a forum to reform global governance. Ione Wells reports from the G20.
Brazil has criticised the way that certain countries are allowed to veto certain votes at the United Nations Security Council. Brazil's Foreign Minister, Mauro Vieira, used his opening remarks at the G20 Summit of Foreign Ministers to say that the UN was facing an unacceptable paralysis on the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine, and it has proved difficult for the UN Security Council to act on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with Russia able to veto votes. Similarly, it has struggled to find consensus on a response to the war in Gaza, with the US using its veto to block calls for a ceasefire on Tuesday.
As the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine approaches, Western officials have warned that the Kremlin has not given up its original goal of subjugating most Ukrainian territory. But they judged that the Kremlin had no real plan of how it would achieve these aims, other than hoping that greater manpower and equipment would eventually prevail. Frank Gardner reports.
This assessment by Western officials says the Kremlin still harbours hopes of achieving its original maximalist aims in Ukraine. In other words, capturing most of its territory and installing a pliant pro-Moscow regime in Kyiv. The Western officials believe that Russia's capacity to produce ammunition is currently insufficient to meet the needs of the conflict, and that Western sanctions have hit its military-industrial complex hard. But on the battlefield, it is Ukraine, not Russia, that is running critically low on ammunition, weapons and troops.
Alabama's main hospital has paused IVF procedures after the Supreme Court in the US state ruled that frozen embryos could be legally considered children. The hospital authorities say they feel for those relying on IVF to build a family, but are concerned they could be prosecuted. Here's Nomia Iqbal.
This ruling by Alabama's Supreme Court basically states that an embryo or fertilized egg is now a person. The southern state, like many others, outlaws all abortions, making no exceptions for cases of rape or incest. However, Alabama is the only one that has defined life as beginning at conception. The case came after 3 families sued a fertility clinic. Their frozen embryos were destroyed when a hospital patient wandered into a storage room, removed them from a cryogenic freezer and dropped them. A lower court ruled the embryos could not be defined as people or children and dismissed the wrongful death claim, but the Supreme Court overruled it.
BBC News. A British ship that was abandoned in the Gulf of Aden after it was hit by missiles fired by Houthi fighters in Yemen is still above water. The Iran-backed rebels claimed on Monday that they had sunk the Ruby Mar. The British government said the vessel had been taking on water and all its 24 crew had been rescued. Boeing has announced that the head of its 737 MAX programme is to leave the company, less than 2 months after a piece of one of its jets blew off during a passenger flight. More details from Molly Perella.
In a staff memo, Boeing said Ed Clark's departure after 18 years at the company was part of a wider shake-up aimed at improving quality and safety. He oversaw the factory in Washington that produced the plane involved in the blowout. A door panel blew off an Alaska Airlines flight shortly after takeoff, leaving a gaping hole. Investigators say it may have been missing 4 bolts. Miraculously, there were no serious injuries. Nearly 200 planes were grounded. Safety campaigners have been calling for new leadership at Boeing since the incident. But trouble with the 737 MAX model began several years ago. A different version of the plane was involved in 2 fatal crashes in 2018 and 2019.
An investigation has been launched in the Netherlands after 2 people died when part of a bridge under construction collapsed onto workers. It happened in the eastern city of Lochem. A section was being hoisted into place when the cable snapped and it plummeted to the ground. A pioneering European Space Agency satellite has fallen back to Earth after almost 3 decades in orbit. The 2-ton ERS-2 spacecraft burned up in the atmosphere over the North Pacific Ocean between Alaska and Hawaii. The satellite was launched in 1995 as an observation platform to monitor the planet. BBC News.